Welcome to The Journey Home. My name is Marcus Grodi, your host for this weekly program. EWTN gives me this wonderful privilege each week to bring before you men and women who, because of the work of the Holy Spirit in their life, are drawn to a closer walk with our Lord Jesus Christ, and particularly with His church. And some of those guests began from a commitment to Jesus Christ into the church. Others began from a different perspective. And our guest tonight, Debbie Herbeck, is a convert from Judaism. And she's here to tell her story. Debbie, welcome to The Journey Home.
Thanks. Good to be here.
Now, I know the EWTN audience is familiar with your husband, Peter.
Yes.
All right. They would know him through Crossing the Threshold.
Crossing the Goal and
Crossing the Goal,
the choices we face.
That's right. That's right. But you've been on their programs too, right?
I was on the Choices We Face probably maybe 3 or 4 years ago.
All right. Okay. But you're not a regular. You kind of...
No, I'm behind the scenes.
You handle the world while he does his program.
Exactly. It's a good partnership.
Well, it's good to have you on The Journey
Thank you.
Home. And to have you tell your story. Because I think especially today, especially those that come from a Jewish faith, we want them to discover the beauty of the fullness, right? I mean, that's our goal. So what I normally do with the guests is invite you to take a big step back and start at the beginning and where you came from spiritually.
Okay. Well, I always like to tell people that I think every Jewish parent has specific hopes and dreams for their children. And growing up, I definitely experienced this in that their child would go to a prestigious university because for many Jews, education is so, so important. And then for their daughters, that they would meet a successful Jewish man, a lawyer or a doctor, and get married and live happily ever after. Well, I did some of that. I went to a prestigious university and I met a wonderful Jewish man, but he was a carpenter from Lazarus. And that's where the story kind of veers off a little bit. So a little bit about myself growing up.
Although, before you get there, your little statement there interests me in terms of Jewish parents really wanting and really seeing education as the key and marrying up. And I mean, is it still fed by the feeling that the way we have to do this to become an accepted part of society in these different countries where we live as Jewish? There's still that always feeling like you're still not accepted fully in the society.
I don't know if I got that message too much growing up. I think just the standards of success were certainly well educated and very high and shooting high. And so I didn't necessarily experience it as so much an inferiority thing as much as just, you're going to set your standards really high.
And I didn't mean inferiority. What I meant was just the prejudice.
Yeah, the prejudice.
That's still there. It's still there. There's still that battle. And sadly, we still live in a world that is, I mean, to a certain extent, you came from one prejudice to another prejudice.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. That's right. So.
Well, I interrupted you.
No, that's
you're
fine.
Ready to start at the beginning.
So I grew up in the Chicago area, in a conservative Jewish home, and for those who aren't familiar with how Judaism works, Judaism has kind of a spectrum, probably a lot like Catholicism in terms of where people are in their belief system and how they're living their faith. So you'd have the Reform Jews, which would be considered more liberal, the conservative Jews, which would be more in the middle, and then the Orthodox or ultra-Orthodox Jews. So
the ones with the curls.
Yes.
Right.
Right, the Hasidic Jews. So my family fell in the middle, which was the conservative Jews, which meant we really tried to keep the laws and to live those out in our daily life. My grandparents, both from Chicago, but my family goes back to Russia, and they were both very involved in the Zionist movement in the 40s. And so growing up, it was really interesting. We'd go down to their apartment on Lakeshore Drive in Chicago to celebrate the Jewish holidays, and lining their walls were the modern heroes of the Jewish faith, people that they knew and had a lot of contact with from their trips to Israel, like Golda Meir and Yitzhak Rabin, people who are considered really the founding parents of Israel as a state. And so that's kind of the environment I grew up in. Is when I was younger, my grandparents went to Israel a lot. My grandmother was the president of Hadassah, which is the largest Jewish charitable organization in the world, and she was the president of the Chicago area, and they both together helped raise a lot of money for Israel. And so a lot of our life as Jews really was surrounded by their involvement with Israel and really being in their home and celebrating the holidays.
I certainly don't mean this to sound like a demeaning question, but was there an active awareness of God?
Good question, yeah. I don't think there was an act in terms of an awareness in terms of a personal God. I went through religious education, which for a Jew would be going to Saturday school, where you learned about the stories from the Torah. And then when I got to be 12, my sister and I, 4 of us in the family, older brother, 2 years older, my sister and I, identical twins, and then a younger brother, 4 years younger. When we were 12, we began our religious education to study for our bat mitzvah. Yeah. Now, a bar bat mitzvah is a rite of passage for Jews. And so we studied for a whole year, learning how to chant our portion out of the scriptures, so that when we turned 13, we could stand up in front of the synagogue, my sister and I, and chant that portion, and then also give a speech and basically say, we're now ready to be adult members of this congregation and to step into our role. So we did that. So we spent a lot of time in synagogue. We went to synagogue every Saturday to observe the Sabbath. We learned Hebrew. We learned from the Old Testament. But I would definitely say growing up, my life was just like any other kid's. Yeah. I did have this sense our life was very insulated in a certain way. Like growing up, I thought that everyone in the world was Jewish. And because we were just surrounded by Jewish friends, Jewish family, our neighborhood, the place we lived was predominantly Jewish, and so I didn't really have any exposure to Christianity. Now, nowadays, that's hard to believe with the internet and the way information is, but back then, if you didn't know other people that had other beliefs, you didn't really have that exposure. So I knew there was a Catholic Church, but I didn't really know who Jesus was. I didn't know what the church taught. I didn't know what Jesus was.
There wasn't probably an active antagonism towards the church. It just wasn't a part of your conversation as a
right.
child.
But there was definitely a sense, I'd say, with like my grandparents and my grandfather, definitely a sense that he communicated to us, and that you're Jewish. It's important to remain Jewish, to continue the continuity of our people. And so there wasn't antagonism, but there was definitely a sense of trying to protect our identity in a way, and our awareness of who we were.
Which would connect with, as we said earlier, the prejudice that you are a people. You are a people that has to preserve these traditions, and you live them out, and that's why the rites of passage and all that, and whether there was an awareness of God in the midst of that can be caught. Someone recently pointed out to me that your experience of the synagogue has amazing parallels of because there's a tabernacle, there's the walking with the law, walking around, people touching the robes. I mean, it's amazing the parallel of that to adoration of the Blessed Sacrament.
It is. And as I got further down the road, which is down my story further, when I finally did get inside a Catholic church, my eyes were open because I thought, hey, you got that from us.
So you had the fullness of that as a child, though. You saw that and experienced that.
Yeah, the traditions and a very strong cultural sense as a Jew of what my identity was. I mean, this is who I was, and I didn't understand everything about it, and it didn't necessarily connect me in a deeply personal way with God, but it connected me with all the Jews, throughout history and in my world, that this was something that was deeply a part of me.
Well, for Christians, confirmation is often just the rite of passage into adulthood, and for far too many, that's when they quit learning their faith. They've arrived. Any parallels?
Absolutely, because I remember after my sister and I were bat mitzvahed, we went to my dad and said, so we're done, right? We can start going to the mall on Saturdays and, playing sports and doing the things we want to be doing. And he pretty much said, well, you're kind of done, but when you're living under my roof and you're still Jewish, we will continue to go to synagogue and continue to learn about our faith and continue to do the things that make us distinctly Jewish. And so, I'm grateful for that now, looking back, that was really a strong part of our identity, and that we had that in our family life together. But I would say in the midst of that, as I continued to, start to grow up and got into early high school, and I'd say there was something specific that happened, a family incident that I think really reoriented my understanding, or I better yet, a lack of understanding of my faith. That was when I was 15. It was December, early December, right around this time of year, and my sister and I were getting ready to go on vacation. We had been invited on a Christmas break vacation with an aunt and uncle, and my brother Mark at that time was in college already. And the three of us were going to be going together on this vacation, and my parents were not going to be going with us. And so my sister and I flew to Florida, and the plan was that my brother Mark was going to meet us in Florida, and we were going to go on to meet other family members. And when we got to Florida, some family friends met us at our gate and said, your parents just called, and your brother Mark's been in a car accident on his way home from college. So you're supposed to come back to our house with us and figure out how serious this is. So I remember we went back to this family's home, and I remember just waiting for any news as to what my brother's condition was. And we didn't know if it was serious. We didn't know if we'd be going home soon. And so I remember I went out in their yard. It was now, by this time it was dark, and I remember standing by their swimming pool. And I remember, it's amazing how you can remember an incident that happened many years ago, as if it happened yesterday. But I remember standing by the pool and praying. Now, I had been in synagogue every Saturday of my whole life almost, and knew thousands of prayers in Hebrew, but I had never really prayed from my heart to God. And I remember turning to God and saying, God, if you're here, if you exist, if you care about our family, save my brother's life. And I prayed that prayer, and probably 5 minutes after I prayed the prayer, the phone rang inside the house. And I could see my mom's friend through the window pick up the phone and answer the phone and put the phone down, and I could tell by the expression on her face that my brother had died. And so I remember just thinking, okay, God, where are you? Where are you now? Are you really there? And really having this, I don't even know if I could call it a crisis of faith, because I don't even know how strongly I believed, but I threw it out there, and it was a horrible result. So my sister and I got back on a plane that next morning, flew back to Chicago to be with our family, my parents grieving the loss of their firstborn son. Now, in Jewish tradition, there are many customs and rites of mourning that you go through as a family. You gather together and you sit Shiva, which is a time when family and friends and members of your congregation come to your home. There's a prayer vigil. They feed you. They comfort you. They stay with you. And I remember during those days still being in shock, but going around and talking to different people, teachers and a favorite aunt, and then finally everyone directed me to the rabbi because I had so many questions and I was filled with such anger. And I remember sitting with the rabbi, he was quite old, and saying, Rabbi, where is my brother? What happens when we die? Where is God? How does God allow this to happen? My brother had been driving home on a snowy 2-lane highway, had been run off the road by a semi, wasn't wearing his seatbelt, and before my parents could even get to the small hospital that he was at, he had died. And I remember the rabbi just was quiet for what seemed like an eternity, and he looked at me and he said, I don't know. I don't have answers to those questions, but I'll pray that you find the answers that you're looking for. And that enraged me even more, because I thought, if you don't know, who does? You're supposed to have the answers. You're supposed to point the way. And that kind of sent me a little bit more into a downward spiral, where I just felt like if my faith, or whoever represents my faith to me, doesn't have the answers to the most basic questions in life, what's the point?
Yeah.
And so, you know,
it's all a sham.
Yeah, it's all a sham. Is this all there is?
Yeah.
And so, you know, I had the next 2 years of high school preparing for college, which I knew I was headed off. And so I had two conflicting things. One was, okay, eat, drink, and be merry, you know, for tomorrow you die, which is a very dangerous philosophy for a high school student. So a lot of distraction in my life, you know, partying and kind of just wanting the pain to go away. But I was also working toward a goal, and that goal was to get good grades so I could go to a good university, so I could get out of the house, so I could, in my mind, make something of my life, because I didn't know how long I had, and somehow wanted to kind of compensate for my brother's loss. Yeah. So a lot going on there in those high school years, and when the time came to make that decision...
Were you still doing your Saturday visits to the synagogue?
No, kind of stopped going to the synagogue. Ironically and sadly, my brother David was bar mitzvahed probably 3 weeks after my brother's death, and that was very painful. A time that was supposed to be the most joyous occasion in a family's life turned into almost like a repeat of the funeral again, all the memories and difficulties. So just a very, very challenging time in our lives as a family. And during this time, at the end of my junior year, beginning of my senior year, I got this idea in my head that I wanted to go to the University of Michigan. And I didn't know then why, but I do now. None of my friends were going. It turned out my sister ended up going to a different school. And so here, for the first time in our lives, we were going to be separated, identical twins. And I got ready to head off to U of M, and she got ready to head off to Indiana University. And really, for the first time, being on my own. But I thought, hey, it's no big deal. There's lots of Jewish kids that go to Michigan. I'm going to find other Jewish kids, and, you know, everything will be fine. Now, I want to say up to this point, I didn't really know very much about Catholicism or Christianity. The first time I ever was in a Catholic church was my senior year in high school on a field trip in downtown Chicago. And I remember walking in and thinking, wow, this is really strange. It was an old Polish Catholic church that smelled like incense, and, you know, they had the big crucifix hanging up.
She even had probably more statues and icons than the average, sure.
And I didn't, you know, at that point it was just weird. I didn't know what to make of it all. But I thought, well, you know, I'm going to the university. I'm going to kind of broaden my understanding of the world. And so I headed off to Michigan. And at that time, my roommate, I was rooming blind. I didn't know who my roommate was. I just had gotten matched up. And I remember my parents dropped me off at the dorm. And before going into my room, my roommate was already there. I decided I would walk up and down the hallway. It was a freshman hall of all girls, to see if there were any other Jewish girls on the floor, because they had all the names on the doors of the girls. And I walked up and down, and I thought, I don't know. I don't see any Bernsteins or Cohens or none of the names.
Recognizable suspects.
No. And you know, I mean, if you're Jewish, you know if a name is Jewish. So I went to my room. My roommate was not Jewish, and she had already been there for a day or so, and her side of the room was set up. And I remember I was quite shy, but I remember I was really making an effort to have conversation with her. So I went over to her side of the room, and she had this picture on her dresser that was a framed photo. And I remember it was a picture of a guy with longish hair. This was in the, you know, the mid-'70s, and brown eyes and a beard. And I remember asking her if it was her boyfriend. And I'm going to show you this picture here because this is the 70s Jesus that I think a lot of people are familiar with.
It could almost been a boy from the 70s.
Yeah.
Of course.
So I remember she gave me this very strange look, like probably thinking, you got into school here? Don't you know who this guy is? And she said, don't you know who that is? And I said, well, no, not really. And she said, well, that's Jesus. And then she followed it with an even stranger line, something like, and he's my boyfriend. So I thought, okay, this girl's a little weird. What have I gotten myself into? But what I found out later about this roommate, this young woman, Lori, was that she was a Catholic. And during that summer before she came to Michigan, she had really been renewed in her Catholic faith and really came to the University of Michigan really wanting to live out her Catholic faith.
Wow.
And I thought, here I am, 40,000 students at U of M, never been exposed to Christianity, and I get put with a Catholic. So that kind of began my journey.
How did she respond to the fact that you were Jewish and that you were actually, well, I shouldn't say you weren't a practicing Jew at the time.
Well, she didn't have a lot of exposure to Jewish people either.
Okay.
But she was, she was very wise in a certain way. Even though her faith, I think, was really genuinely alive to her, she knew that we had to coexist in this tiny little dorm room together. And so I think she really did try and live her faith, but she certainly didn't sit me down and try and, talk to me a whole lot about what she believed.
Oh.
But at the same time, there was another girl that lived on my floor. Her name was Sarah. And I had never met anyone like her before. She talked nonstop about her faith. She played guitar. Now, remember, this is the 70s, so she would walk around with her guitar, knock on people's doors, and sing and talk about Jesus. And ironically, she and I became friends. And this is a wonderful thing about just getting to know somebody who's really kind of alive in their faith. There was something about her that was very kind of strange to me because I'd never seen anybody like her, but something that really was attractive to me because she was the genuine article. She was the real deal. There's just something very joyful about her. And so we began this friendship, and the only thing we really had in common was we were both athletes. We both liked to play sports, so we would go to the gym together and work out and play on sports teams together. And in the course of that time together, she would begin to talk to me about things that she was learning in the Bible. She was also a Catholic, recently renewed in her faith. And we would have these debates where she'd quote something out of the New Testament, and I'd kind of counter with something out of the Old Testament. And neither of us really knew what we were talking about, and because she was so new in her faith, and because she was Catholic, unfortunately, she wasn't very systematic in the way she
that kind of
evangelized.
Surprised me that the two girls you meet are both reborn again in their faith. We're both Catholics.
Yeah, isn't it something?
That in itself
that was very unusual.
The work of the Lord.
Absolutely, absolutely. So here I am. I kind of find myself surrounded by some of these Christian girls on my floor, having never been exposed to Christianity. So I went one day, I'm going to show you this Bible in a minute because this is very instrumental in the whole story here. One day I went to a class that I was taking. I was an English major, and we were studying, it was called Great Books, and we were studying 1st and 2nd century literature. And one day the professor came to class and he said, I want you to read the book of Romans and write an essay on it. And I went up to him afterwards and I said, well, I don't have the book of Romans. And he said, it's in the New Testament. And I said, well, I'm not allowed to have one of those. And he said, I don't really care. Get yourself a New Testament and read the book of Romans. And I really had the sense that I was not supposed to buy a New Testament because I knew that was a Christian book. But I knew that my friend Sarah had a Bible because I had seen it in her room. So I went down to her room and I explained the assignment, and she said, you can borrow my Bible. And she said, let me just warn you, the book of Romans is very difficult. A lot of Christians have a hard time understanding it. So if you need help, I'd be glad to help you out. So she took the little red ribbon, which I learned later was like a little bookmark, and she put it in where the book of Romans was. And I carried it back to my dorm room, and I opened it up, and I started to read it. and I got about into the first paragraph, the first section, and I was lost. I had no context for understanding what Paul was talking about. So I started to kind of just leaf through her Bible, because I had actually never met anyone who owned their own Bible. You know, Jews consider the scriptures so sacred that really the only time that you'd hear the scriptures read or discussed would be in the synagogue. And if somebody did have a Bible in their home and the Bible were to fall to the ground, you'd have to pick it up and kiss it as a sign of reverence for God's Word. So here's someone that not only owns her own Bible, has her name inscribed on the front, not only is she reading it, but she's writing in it. And not only is she writing in it, she's writing in almost the whole thing. You can see this is Ephesians. She's pretty much underlined the whole New Testament. And then she's writing in the margins, and she's writing in the back, notes, things that come to her. And not only does she have a New Testament, but she's got my scriptures in here too. And as I began to look through her Bible, I began to feel like I was reading someone's personal diary. And I thought, this is the strangest thing, because she actually feels like she's speaking to God through these words. And then she actually feels like God is speaking back to her. And it seems like there's a little bit of a dialogue going on here. And this, for some reason that I didn't really understand, made me very, very nervous. And I remember not even doing the assignment, giving her Bible back to her, almost like, here, take it. Because I had the sense that if I kept this too long and I really read this, that it might have some impact on me. And it wasn't until later on in my journey, much later, that I opened to the book of Hebrews. And I read, the Word of God is living and active. It's sharper than any two-edged sword. And I felt like I was holding a two-edged sword, and that I really needed to give it back before that sword really pierced my heart. So that was really my first exposure to an aspect of her relationship with God that I found extremely personal, but I didn't understand it at all. So we're still in freshman year now. And
you've gotten rid of this Bible.
I've gotten rid of the Bible and just try to focus on studying. Sarah and I are still friends, having occasional conversations. And it's probably around February now, and this is Lent. I didn't know it was Lent, but looking back now, it was during Lent, and I was studying in my room, and Sarah and a couple other girls knocked on my door, and they said, we're taking a study break. We're going to go down to the lounge in the dorm and watch a movie. This is back when kids actually left their rooms. You know, now everyone's got big TVs in the room, but people were actually congregating in the lounge to watch a movie. So I sat down on the floor with Sarah, and this movie came on, and it was crowded. There were a lot of kids in there. And I remember thinking, what is this movie? And I actually turned to her and I said, what are we watching? And she said, oh, it's nothing. I said, Sarah, what is this? And she said, oh, it's a movie called Jesus of Nazareth. And it was being shown in 2 parts for the Lenten season. And I remember sitting there and watching it as the story unfolds. And I'm watching Jesus as a young boy, and Jesus in the synagogue, and Jesus being presented for his circumcision and all the things in his life. And I remember turning to Sarah and saying, he's Jewish. She said, yeah. I said, I never knew Jesus was a Jew. No one ever told me that Jesus was a Jew. And as I watched just the story of his life unfold, I thought, not only is he a Jew, he's a good Jew. He follows the law. He obeys the commandments. He listens to his mother. He's a good Jewish boy. And immediately, now, you know, this is Hollywood. This is, you know, a Hollywood version, but this is the only version of Jesus that I've had so far. Right. There's something, I felt this incredible kinship to him. No longer was he like this historical figure in the Christian world, but he was a Jewish boy, a Jewish man. And I felt this connection to him that I couldn't even explain. And kind of being drawn to him in terms of who he was as a man and the way that he carried himself. And there was something about him that I thought, I wish I could be like that. And then this scene unfolds, and it was near the end of the evening, near the end of the first segment, where Jesus comes to a town. It's the town of Bethany. And he's met by a woman who falls at his feet and is weeping. And she says to him, "Lord, where were you? If you had been here, our brother would not have died."
Oh, wow.
And I felt like this was a script out of my own life.
Wow, wow, wow.
And I thought, you've got to be kidding. Those were almost the words that I had spoken to God just a few years previously when my brother Mark had died. And I remember everything in me wanted to just get up and run out of the room. I just thought, I just cannot deal with this. I can't face this again. But I sat there and I watched as that story unfolded, and I watched as Jesus went to the tomb where Lazarus had been for 4 days. And I knew as a Jew that he was ritually unclean, that Jesus had no business going into that tomb. And I watched as he called forth Lazarus from the tomb and raised him from the dead. And if I could have been looking at myself having an out-of-body experience, I was probably sitting there like, and I watched as this happened, and I thought, what if he is the Messiah? What if this man has power over death? What if death isn't the final answer? And then all the what-ifs about my brother Mark, all the what-ifs about my own life, all the questions that I thought were a closed door with no answers suddenly became what if. So I went back to my room that night. The scene ended kind of around that time. I went back to my room that night and I couldn't sleep. And I went down the hall to my friend Sarah's room and I knocked on her door. And she opened the door this wide. I didn't say anything, she didn't say anything, and she just handed the Bible to me. And I took her Bible back to my room, and I opened to where that little ribbon was, and I read the Gospel of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And then I got to that scene in John where Jesus comes to Bethany, and I got to those lines where Jesus says to Martha and Mary, "I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will never die, but he who believes in me will have life everlasting." And I didn't know what a lot of that meant. I didn't really know what resurrection meant, but I knew there was a promise implicit there about life and death. And that night, for the second time in my life, in my dorm room, I got down on my knees and I prayed. And I said, "God, I don't know if you're real and if you can hear me. And I don't know who this man Jesus is, but if he's the one, if he's the Messiah, the one our people have been waiting for, show me and give me the faith to believe." And that was another door that opened.
Why don't we pause?
Yes.
All right, let's pause there, and we'll take a little break, and then we'll come back, because there we have an awakening of the Lord in your life. We'll see where he took you after that.
Okay.
Welcome back to The Journey Home. Our guest tonight is Debbie Herbeck, and we've interrupted your journey right at the moment when the Lord used Hollywood.
That's right.
To awaken you to, I mean, as you said, it's still kind of amazing today to think about a Jewish girl being brought up in our culture without really knowing Jesus. But as you said, if you're in your little culture of Judaism, no one brings it up. You don't.
Right.
We're not automatically infused with an understanding of Jesus, but yet the Lord used this movie to awaken you.
He did. He did. And I would say, one thing I want to say is during this whole time, I never thought about converting. Like, I was just trying to seek truth. I was trying to understand. I was trying to seek the person of Jesus, thinking and hoping and praying that he was the Messiah. I never thought about converting. I never thought about leaving the Jewish faith. And so it was just kind of a gradual movement toward the Lord of seeking and really seeking after him. And so I had this Bible now, and my friend Sarah graciously said, "Why don't you keep it? Read it." And so I began to read the scriptures. I began to read the New Testament, primarily the Gospels, because I was hungry to know who this Jesus was and what he was teaching and what he was saying, and also trying to read it in light of the Old Testament and some of the things in Isaiah and things that were being prophesied about, had been prophesied about the Messiah. And so I began to read things in the New Testament that were shocking me. Things like Jesus saying, whoever does not take up his cross and follow me is not worthy to be my disciple. Whoever does not hate father, mother, sister, brother, who's ever not willing to, in some way, love me more than their family is not willing. And I thought, this is what it means. This is what modern day Christians are doing. But I was going through these and I was doing what the scriptures describes as counting the cost. I was seeing what the cost was of being a disciple, and I was counting that in my head in terms of what I knew that it would cost me to really be a disciple of Jesus. Well, I went home that summer and, continued to read this kind of quietly. Yeah, very quietly, and really felt like I was caught between two worlds. I was really in the world and the life that I had lived before praying that prayer, and then really living in a world where I almost had different vision about what was possible, kind of in the spiritual world. And so I was home that summer and continued to correspond with my friend Sarah and went back to school in the fall. And I remember saying to Sarah, listen, if Jesus was a Jew, and I believe he was, historically he was a Jew, why aren't there other Jews that believe he's the Messiah? And I remember she said, oh, but there are other Jews. She said, I actually know a girl who believes in Jesus, and she's Jewish. Would you like to meet her? And I remember saying, no, absolutely not. And so Sarah kind of left it at that, and because, again, I was not wanting to be convinced to be converted. And so that, about a week later, I was going to synagogue, actually services that were being held on campus. It was the holiest day of the year for Jews. It was Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. And I was going to synagogue like I had gone all my life. And when I was leaving there, walked out and literally bumped into this young woman, another Jewish girl who was there at the services, and we began to talk as we were walking through campus. And as we were parting ways there, she said, do you mind if I introduce myself? So she said, hi, my name is so-and-so, and I just want to tell you a little bit about myself. And she said, I grew up in a Jewish home. My grandfather was a rabbi, and when I was 16, I came to know Jesus as the Messiah. And so here it was, my first Jewish believer in Jesus. And she and I became fast friends, and she was also at Michigan, and so we spent the next few years together. And so, here's another window that's opening, another question that's getting answered for me. Well, this is now my sophomore year. I'm living in the dorms. My friend Sarah's moved out of the dorms, but we're continuing our friendship and our relationship. And a lot of different things happen, but if I can kind of cut to the chase here, I was getting ready to go home for Thanksgiving that fall, and I'd been reading, as I said, a lot of the Old Testament and New Testament. I remember sitting down with my parents. I was home before my sister, and we were having dinner in a Chinese restaurant. And I remember this very clearly. It's the typical college kid who wants to go home and tell their parents what they've been learning. So I said, I've been reading a lot of the scriptures, and to say that to a Jew meant that I was reading the Old Testament. And I said, do you think anything in Isaiah could really be pointing to Jesus as the Messiah? And I remember looking over, and my mother's like choking on her egg roll at this point, and my dad has this panicked look on his face, and they said, we need to go home right now. So we went back to their home, and they called some friends of theirs. It turns out my dad had some good friends who were business associates, and they were Catholic. And they said, we're really nervous. We think our daughter's thinking about converting. Please come over to the house. And being the good Catholics that
they invited the Catholics over for that.
They invited the Catholics over for that. And, unfortunately, I think the Catholics weren't very well catechized, and so they came over and kind of said to me, what are you thinking? Don't do this. You're Jewish. Stay Jewish. Don't convert. Don't think about doing anything that's going to hurt your family. But what I can say about that weekend was it was kind of like God was giving me like a sneak preview. Again, counting the cost. Yeah. And in that weekend, I had a tremendous experience of what this decision might cost me. It was very difficult for my parents, very emotional. I definitely experienced some kind of distancing themselves a little bit because they didn't really know how to handle it. And so I went back to school and continued to read the scriptures. And 2 days after I was back in school, I had a dream. And in the dream, I was standing in this long, dark corridor, and I heard this voice call out to me, "Who do you say that I am?" And in the dream, it was dark, and I couldn't see anyone. And I said, "I don't know who you are." And a second time, this voice called out to me, "Who do you say that I am?" And I looked down the hall, and I could just see like the outline of a person, but I couldn't see their face. And I was frustrated. And I said, "I don't know who you are, but I want to know." And then a third time, "Who do you say that I am?" And I looked up, and Jesus was standing before me in this dream. And I said, "You're Jesus. You're Jesus. You're Jesus." And I woke up from the dream. It was a very clear dream. And I was very disturbed by it in a certain way. And I was going to meet my friend Sarah at the gym that morning. And I told her, I said, "I had this dream and Jesus appeared to me. Do you think there's anything to it?" And she's like, "Yeah, I think so." She's probably like, "Wow, this is amazing." And I said, "It's too hard. I knew it was Jesus, but I don't have the faith to put my whole life into his hands." And she said something I thought was very wise at the time, and I knew came right out of the scripture. She said, "Keep asking, keep seeking, keep knocking, and God will reveal himself to you." And so I did that. I continued to take this script, the Bible, and every night on my bed I would pray that prayer. "Jesus, if you're real, if you're the Messiah, show me." And now I started to pray for faith and give me the faith to believe. So probably a week after that, I was in my dorm room. It was nighttime. My roommate was sleeping. I was sitting on my bed at the University of Michigan, one of the most secular universities in the country, and I prayed that prayer. And in that moment, as I prayed that prayer, I had this sense of the room filling with this incredible presence and light and warmth, and I knew that I was in the presence of God. And I was instantly struck by my unworthiness and my sinfulness. And I didn't really know how to phrase it. I guess Christians now would call it the sinner's prayer or whatever. But I basically just said to God, "I've messed up. I've broken or bent most of your commandments. And if you, with your help, I can do it better. If you give me a second chance." And in that moment when I prayed that and expressed that to God, I experienced Jesus being with me there in the room. And he was standing there like this, saying, "Here, it's for you." And I had this, wasn't an audible voice, but a sense in my heart that Jesus was really speaking to me and saying, and I remember thinking, what is it? And he said, "It's faith. You prayed for it. You asked for it. It's a gift. You did nothing to earn it or deserve it, but it's here. It's for you." And honestly, Marcus, in all those years of never knowing Jesus, in all those months of questioning and doubting, when he held out his hand to me in one split second, I knew it was all true. I just knew. I knew because I knew, and I knew that no one could take that knowledge from me, that it was true, that Jesus was the Messiah. So I always say, what do you do when Jesus comes to you in your dorm room? Well, if you're smart, you say yes. And so that night, I told the Lord, "I believe that you're Jesus, the Messiah. I believe in what you teach, and I want to give my whole life to you, and I want to walk in faith with you, no matter what the cost." And I had a tremendous sense of peace, that God was with me, that he was caring for me, that he would take care of the future, that he would take care of all the unknowns, all the family, and all my concerns. And so that night, I walked through that door of faith and said yes to Jesus.
I'm not sure that this question touches what you'd experienced during that time. But did you have a sense of Mark's intercession, of Mark smiling on you during that time? Did it ever did you ever think about?
Yeah, I
human
did later,
relationship?
not in that moment, but really like the weeks and months that followed as I really kind of dove into prayer. Now, not just seeking the Lord out there, but really Him beside me and within me, walking me through my grief and my questions. I had a very strong sense of, that Romans 8 passage, all things work together for the good, and kind of getting a little bit of a glimpse of God's eternal perspective on what we call problems.
Right.
So.
Right, and giving a little more hopeful
Absolutely.
Feeling for your brother who had been taken, and really was a spark that started you on this big part of the journey.
Yeah, absolutely.
So at this point, you're a believer in Jesus Christ, a disciple of Jesus Christ. Are you anything? I mean, did your Messianic Jewish friend bring you into a particular group?
Yes, at that point, I decided to stay in Ann Arbor, where I was in school for the summer, because I knew that I needed to be surrounded by other believers to really help me grow more. And, in that moment when I said yes to Jesus, I was really saying yes to the person that I was encountering of Jesus. I hadn't even gotten to the book of Revelation yet. I didn't know all of the teaching and the doctrine, and I knew that would come. It's a little bit like falling in love, and then you discover really more about the person that you've fallen in love with. So I stayed in Ann Arbor. I was baptized that summer in a swimming pool and joined a Messianic congregation, kind of like a free church, where a lot of, it wasn't really a Messianic congregation, but there were a lot of Messianic Jews that were part of it. And I felt very much at home because it wasn't as much of a cultural leap, we were still kind of discussing and learning about the scriptures through a Jewish lens and a Jewish context. And that was a great place for me to be for a number of years because I was really able to grow in my faith in a way that was comfortable. So I graduated from the University of Michigan and had some decisions to make. And I knew that I wanted to stay in Ann Arbor. And I decided really, I was just really set, my heart was set on fire to really live in a radical way for Jesus. This was, in the early 80s, and I really wanted to just give Him everything. And so I really set aside a year to really do direct ministry. And I was working at the University of Michigan doing campus ministry, talking to anybody and everybody I could about Jesus, helping others, college students, come to know Him. I was doing some writing and working for Catholic publishing company at that time. And
you weren't Catholic.
I wasn't Catholic at the time. So I was around other Catholics, but I was really in a more, I guess you could say, ecumenical environment. So I wasn't even really learning that much about the Catholic faith, so to speak. So after a while, I decided that I thought, I was starting to discern my vocation. Now, that's a very Catholic term. I wasn't saying it in those terms, but I knew that now that I'd given my whole life to Jesus, I wanted to give Him every part of it. And if He was going...
That is very much an evangelical...
Yeah.
What do you want me to do with your life, Lord?
Exactly.
And you knew you were going to stand before God, accountable for the life He's given you, so what do you want it to be, Lord?
Exactly.
So,
and I knew that He was probably calling me to be in some, kind of full-time ministry. But I thought, are you calling me to be married? Are you calling me to be single? And fortunately, I was around other people that were really trying to live out those lifestyles. And so I spent some time really living with a group of women who were really pursuing the single lifestyle. Some of them were Catholic and some of them were Protestant. And after doing that for about 3 or 4 years, I definitely had a sense that God was calling me to marriage. And I remember at this point I was now doing campus ministry full-time, and I had met a young man who was also doing campus ministry who had moved to Ann Arbor from Minnesota, and his name was Peter. And this is where he comes into the equation. He had just was discerning the priesthood and had decided not to become a priest, but was still kind of in the process of discerning his vocation. And we became friends, and it became clear to me that God was calling me to be married, and he had the same sense. And so we get to this point in our relationship where Peter says, I really like you. I want to marry a Catholic. I'd like to pursue a relationship with you. And I said to Peter, I really like you. I'd like to pursue a relationship with you, but I don't want to become Catholic just, just out of convenience. I'd made too many decisions that were really difficult for me, and whatever I wanted to do, I wanted to do out of conviction. So we cut a deal, and here's the deal. I said, I will investigate the Catholic Church on my own. You cannot talk to me about it. I will meet with a priest, and we'll see where this comes out. And so he was very agreeable to that. And I began to meet with a priest who also happened to be a friend that I had met through other people. And we began to have these weekly meetings. And he just said, come and let's discuss. Now, for most evangelicals who are coming into the Catholic Church, they've probably got a list of
right.
probably 5 or 6, and you can probably name them along with me.
Right.
I don't think I had any of those biases, but I certainly was pretty ignorant about the Catholic Church. Sure. So we began to discuss things like the communion of saints and purgatory and Mary. We kind of checked off the list. Mary was actually kind of down here. And I began to go to Mass, to sit in the back and to observe. And as I said before, I felt like, oh my gosh, they got that from us. They got that from us. They stand when God's word is read. We do that in the synagogue. The whole sense of the tabernacle and the Ark of the Covenant. And I began to read and study about the Eucharist and how that connects with the Passover. And just a lot of things were beginning to connect in my head and in my heart. And then an amazing thing happened on a more personal level as I began to meet Mary in the Scriptures and understand her role in the church. And as I always say, there's nothing like a good Jewish mother to make a home for you. And I think that's really what Mary did for me in the Catholic faith, was she really began to make the church feel like home to me. And what I sensed when I went to Mass, just even observing, was the things that were so important to me as a Jew: the timelessness, the whole sense of liturgy, and being connected. As a Jew, when you go to synagogue and you hear the readings, that's what's being read all over the world in every single synagogue, and that's what's happening in the Mass. Yeah. So a deep sense of connection there, of a real sense of kind of coming home, and with a very joyful heart, I came into the church on Palm Sunday, and then just a month after that, Peter and I were married. My family agreed to come to the wedding.
Yeah, I was wondering how they were responding
to
all this.
They said, we'll come, but not if you get married in a church. And so we got permission from our bishop to be married in a hotel. And we had a rabbi and a priest, our priest friend, concelebrating. And it was very interesting. My parents brought a couple hundred Jewish friends and family from Chicago, and we really celebrated it. We were married under a huppah. We said our Catholic and our Hebrew vows under the huppah. We broke the glass and did all the Jewish traditions and really tried to merge those traditions. So that was really the beginning of all that. And the whole time, I felt like God was saying, I'm not taking away, I've added something here. And so it was a real sense of completion for me in coming home, and a real sense of being able to express my identity as a Messianic Jewish Catholic. And
in marrying Peter, you certainly did indeed end up with an apostolic life.
Yes, we certainly did. We certainly did. And, honestly, that's one of the things that drew us together, I think, was that real sense of calling to go out and do that together for the Lord.
That's right, and you're doing it to this day. I've got an email, Jenny from Canada. How can I best convey to my Jewish friend the fullness of the Christian faith? I don't want to strain our friendship, but would love for him to experience all that Christianity has to give.
Yeah, that's a tough one. It's a question I get a lot. I think, as you listen to my story, there was a lot of relational evangelism going on. Right. I really trusted the people who began to teach me about who Jesus was. I think for any Jew, understanding the Jewish roots of Christianity really helps, because to see it as a real continuation of what the Jewish faith taught and what God promised. So I think, you have to really understand it. And a lot of Jews today don't even understand their own faith and understand the Scriptures.
It's a good point. The first step for reaching out to a Jewish friend is to get them to know their own faith.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And then there's a lot of commonality that you can find in that. So I think just to get them hungry to learn more about who Jesus was as a Jew, and even take Jesus out of the equation for a minute and just about their own faith and really seeking after God.
Both from a Jewish and a Catholic perspective, the bat mitzvah and confirmation can be misunderstood. How about a word on that? Helping people appreciate what this is really all about, confirmation, as well as bat mitzvah. I mean,
well, I think, when Peter and I had our children, we have 4 children, and we had a very strong sense that we wanted to give them the gift of their identity as both Jews and Catholics. And so we celebrated all the holidays and the feasts, and we talked about Jesus being the fulfillment. And even though my kids weren't bar bat mitzvah, they were confirmed. And we talked about that in light of, what the bar mitzvah means and the rite of passage. And confirmation is all of that and so much more, because not only is in the bar mitzvah is it you standing up as a human and saying, this is what I give to God, but in the confirmation it's God saying, I back my own promise, and I'm giving you what you need to live it. And so it's really a beautiful thing in terms of the Holy Spirit really empowering us to live the life.
That's right. I mean, there are many things, of course, but really that aspect of the Holy Spirit coming within us at baptism, being empowered in confirmation, living out the gifts, that's really a key thing that, again, just as in the Jewish faith, you can take your bat mitzvah for granted, we can take the confirmation for granted. And really what it's all about in our faith life.
Right, it becomes just a humanistic thing that we do. One of the ceremonial things we do is, as opposed to saying, this is really going to empower me to live my faith.
Well, Debbie, thanks for sharing your witness.
You're welcome.
On the journey
Always
home.
glad to do it. Thank you.
If they want to connect somehow with the website, is there one we ought to mention?
Yes, renewalministries.net.
All right. And they'll have seen that on all the other programs with Ralph and Peter. But then also they can connect with them as well as you. All right. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Debbie, and thank you for joining us on this episode of The Journey Home. As she said, we've all got Jewish friends. Let's invite them relationally to get to know their faith, because we believe it's a stepping stone for the fullness. And so do that in obedience to our God. Bless you. See you soon.